Look at the face of the Great Sphinx of Giza. For generations, historical textbooks have confidently declared it the monumental visage of Pharaoh Khafre, carved into the bedrock around 2500 BCE to serve as a silent guardian for his sprawling pyramid complex. But what if the very stone of this iconic sentinel tells a vastly different story? One written not in the hieroglyphs of dynastic Egypt, but in the deep, undeniable language of geology. The prevailing timeline of human civilization rests heavily on this single, widely accepted attribution. Yet a meticulous examination of the monument's physical weathering suggests an origin story that shatters our accepted historical frameworks. We are told the timeline of human progress is a steady, linear ascent, but the bedrock of the Giza Plateau whispers of a forgotten epoch. The orthodox narrative of ancient Egyptian civilization anchors the Great Sphinx firmly within the fourth dynasty of the Old Kingdom. Egyptologists point to a matrix of circumstantial evidence, primarily the physical proximity of the Sphinx to Khafre's Valley Temple and a highly disputed, partially erased syllable on a granite stela positioned between its massive paws. This consensus paints a picture of a unified, highly organized society emerging rapidly from the arid sands to execute an architectural masterwork of unprecedented scale. It is a neat, cohesive timeline that places the dawn of monumental stone carving neatly within a specific dynastic window, leaving absolutely no room for precursors, older cultures, or forgotten epochs of high civilization. Yet, the bedrock of the Giza Plateau harbors a profound and highly visible contradiction. When independent geologists turned their attention away from the cultural artifacts and focused strictly on the limestone itself, they identified severe, undulating fissures etched deeply into the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. These are not the horizontal, abrasive scouring marks characteristic of wind and sand erosion, which dominate the rest of the plateau's Old Kingdom structures. Instead, they present the classic vertical coving typical of prolonged, heavy precipitation. This water erosion hypothesis introduces a devastating variable into the traditional chronology, challenging the very foundation of how we date the origins of monumental architecture. To understand the magnitude of this geological anomaly, we must look to the principles of stratigraphy, the geological study of rock layers and layering, alongside established weathering mechanisms. Limestone degrades in highly specific, observable ways depending on its environmental exposure. Windborne sand acts as a horizontal abrasive, stripping away softer rock layers and leaving harder strata protruding in sharp, angular relief. Conversely, sustained rainfall cascading over an edge creates deep, vertical runoff channels, carving rounded, undulating profiles deep into the stone. The enclosure walls surrounding the Sphinx exhibit the latter with textbook precision, a physical impossibility in the hyper-arid desert climate that has defined the region for the last 5 millennia. The paleoclimatology of North Africa provides the missing temporal key to this mystery. To find a period of sustained, heavy rainfall capable of inflicting such extensive water damage on solid limestone bedrock, we must look far beyond the reign of Khafre and the Old Kingdom. The geological record indicates that the last time the Giza Plateau experienced a climate wet enough to produce these specific erosion patterns was during the Neolithic subpluvial, a period of intense monsoon rains that ended abruptly around 3000 BCE. To account for the sheer depth of the fissures, climatologists argue the monument must have been exposed to these torrential rains for centuries, pushing its initial excavation back to at least 5000 to 7000 BCE, deep into the heart of pre-dynastic Egypt. The introduction of this hard geological data ignited a fierce, ongoing clash between established Egyptology and the earth sciences. Traditional historians argue that attributing the Sphinx to an earlier epoch creates an unacceptable historical vacuum, demanding the existence of an advanced, unknown civilization capable of moving hundreds of tons of stone long before the invention of the wheel or the widespread use of copper tools. In defense of the accepted timeline, Orthodox scholars attribute the anomalous weathering to the haloclasty effect, a process where salt crystallization causes limestone to flake and crumble from the inside out. However, this chemical weathering mechanism entirely fails to explain the distinct vertical runoff channels that cascade down the enclosure walls, leaving the orthodox defense scientifically incomplete and heavily debated. If we accept the unyielding testimony of the geological evidence, The Great Sphinx ceases to be merely a tribute to an Old Kingdom pharaoh and transforms into a repurposed relic of a forgotten age. The implications of this shift are staggering. It suggests that Khafre did not commission the monument from untouched bedrock, but rather inherited a vastly older, highly eroded structure already protruding from the desert sand. His artisans may have simply recarved the heavily weathered head, which is noticeably and disproportionately small compared to the massive, elongated body, to reflect his own likeness or that of contemporary deities. This hypothesis elegantly explains why the head shows far less water erosion than the deeply scarred body and the surrounding enclosure walls. The physical evidence of an older origin extends far beyond the Sphinx itself, reaching into the adjacent structures known as the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple. The massive limestone blocks used to construct the core of these temples were quarried directly from the Sphinx enclosure during the initial excavation of the monument's body. These core blocks, some weighing upwards of 200 tons, exhibit the exact same severe precipitation weathering as the enclosure walls from which they were cut. Crucially, these heavily eroded limestone blocks were later faced with smooth, precisely cut granite casing stones by Old Kingdom builders. The granite shows absolutely no such water damage, proving definitively that the core limestone was already ancient and heavily weathered before the Old Kingdom architects arrived to renovate the site. The ghost of that overlooked evidence still haunts the textbooks, challenging the very core of our historical models. Acknowledging that monumental architecture of this immense scale existed millennia before the accepted dawn of civilization requires a total dismantling of our linear model of human progress. It implies that the societal sophistication required to organize massive labor forces, master advanced quarrying techniques, and execute complex geometric designs did not emerge in a sudden miraculous flash during the 3rd millennium BCE. Instead, it points to a profound cultural legacy inherited from an older, sophisticated society that thrived during the wetter, greener epoch of the Sahara, whose history was subsequently erased by drastic climate change and the relentless march of the desert. Textual fragments, often dismissed or marginalized by orthodox scholars when they contradict the established timeline, offer tantalizing support for this older chronology. The inventory stela, a limestone artifact discovered in the mid-19th century at Giza, explicitly lists the Great Sphinx as an already existing monument during the reign of Khafre's predecessor, Khufu. The text describes Khufu uncovering the monument, clearing it of encroaching sand, and repairing a nearby temple dedicated to the goddess Isis. For decades after its discovery, this primary source was cited as historical fact, until the Khafre attribution became rigidly entrenched in the early 20th century, forcing scholars to reevaluate the stela to fit the newly accepted narrative. Modern Egyptology routinely dismisses the inventory stela as a much later piece of historical fiction, a retrospective forgery created during the 26th dynasty to bolster local cults and political claims. This dismissal relies heavily on linguistic analysis of the text's grammar and epigraphy, the study of ancient inscriptions, which appear anachronistic for the Old Kingdom period. Yet this rigid rejection ignores the highly common ancient Egyptian practice of copying and updating older, decaying papyri onto durable stone for preservation. If the stela is indeed a later copy of a genuine Old Kingdom record, its explicit assertion that the Sphinx predates Khafre aligns perfectly with the geological weathering data, forming a compelling synthesis of hard earth science and ancient textual tradition. Beyond the realms of geology and contested texts, the interdisciplinary science of archaeoastronomy provides yet another layer of overlooked context that challenges the Old Kingdom attribution. The Great Sphinx faces due east, staring directly at the rising sun on the vernal equinox. In the epoch of 2500 BCE, the constellation rising behind the sun on this critical astronomical day was Taurus, the bull. However, if we wind the astronomical clock back to the era of heavy rainfall, around 500 BCE, the equinoctial sun rose directly against the celestial backdrop of the constellation Leo. A massive lion-bodied monument gazing directly at its celestial counterpart during a profound climatic transition offers a symbolic cohesion and intentionality entirely absent from the Old Kingdom timeline. The echoes of that long-lost civilization still resonate clearly through these precise alignments. This potential age of 500 BCE correlates directly with the end of the Younger Dryas, a period of massive global upheaval, rapid sea level rise, and intense, catastrophic climatic shifts. Could the Great Sphinx have been conceived not as a pharaonic tomb marker, but as a terrestrial anchor, a monumental timestamp commemorating a pivotal, perhaps devastating moment in human antiquity? The extreme weathering on the body, combined with the specific astronomical orientation, suggests a purpose far more profound and ancient than simply guarding a nearby pyramid complex for a fourth dynasty king. The sheer logistics of the original excavation further challenge the established narrative of primitive origins. To carve the Sphinx, unknown engineers removed thousands of tons of solid bedrock to create the surrounding trench, carefully extracting the massive blocks used for the adjacent temples without shattering them. Moving these 200-ton megaliths requires a level of mechanical sophistication, understanding of friction, and structural engineering that starkly contradicts the primitive tools attributed to pre-dynastic cultures. The presence of these blocks, intricately fitted and heavily weathered, stands as silent, unyielding testimony to a lost technological capacity that predates the wheel and the pulley by thousands of years. We are forced by this confluence of evidence to reconsider the very nature of the Giza Plateau itself. Rather than a blank, untouched canvas upon which Fourth Dynasty pharaohs suddenly decided to build the world's most massive structures, it appears to have been a deeply sacred, highly developed ancient site long before the first pyramid was ever raised. The Old Kingdom rulers were likely not the original architects of the plateau's master plan, but rather inheritors, restorers, and perhaps usurpers. They claimed, modified, and built upon the colossal remnants of a forgotten epoch, attempting to tie their own lineage to the mythical, pre-dynastic gods and ancestors who first shaped the bedrock. The fierce resistance to this geological and astronomical reevaluation highlights a systemic vulnerability in historical scholarship. When physical evidence directly contradicts a foundational timeline, the academic tendency is often to compartmentalize, explain away, or simply ignore the anomaly, rather than undertake the painful, paradigm-shifting process of rewriting history. The water erosion hypothesis does not simply change the date of a single, albeit famous, statue. It shatters the entire paradigm of linear cultural evolution, demanding that we acknowledge periods of high civilization followed by catastrophic decline, a cyclical view of history that terrifies the orthodox establishment and disrupts deeply entrenched academic careers. The profound implications of this ancient weathering stretch far beyond the shifting sands of Egypt. If a civilization capable of such monumental engineering and precise astronomical alignment existed thousands of years before the Sumerians or the Old Kingdom Egyptians, we must ask what else has been lost to the ravages of time, rising seas, and climate change. The Great Sphinx, battered by millennia of heavy rains and subsequent desert winds, stands as a massive, eroding puzzle piece that absolutely refuses to fit into the accepted picture of human history. It challenges us to look past culturally constructed narratives and listen strictly to the objective, unyielding testimony of the Earth itself. As we continue to scrutinize the deep vertical fissures of the Sphinx enclosure, the ultimate question remains suspended in the dry desert air, demanding an answer. Who were the original architects of this colossal lion, and what catastrophic events erased their memory, their technology, and their identity from the annals of human achievement? The investigation into our ancient past is far from closed. In many ways, it is only just beginning. The stone has finally spoken, revealing a history far older, far more complex, and infinitely more mysterious than we ever dared to imagine, waiting for those willing to read the overlooked evidence written deep in the bedrock.